Today we're going to take painting down to the bare bones. Ow, stop it. Welcome to another episode of TheGameSmith. In today's episode, we're going to be painting a bone Naga. Now, normally we don't paint miniatures on this channel because there are so many wonderful creators out there who do a much better job at doing this than I do. But I had a Patreon subscriber specifically request that I make a tutorial on how to paint bones. So this is for you, Triceratops kid. Here we have a bone Naga from Nolzur's Marvelous Miniatures from WizKid's Unpainted series of miniatures. This monster is all bone, so I thought it would be perfect for a tutorial on how to paint bone. There are numerous monsters composed primarily of bone we could use for this project, such as a bone devil, a bone golem, or even a huge undead dragon. For new painters, the best place to start is with a large based miniature, just like our bone Naga here. If you start with an even bigger medium-based creature, such as this mimic, new painters may find themselves frustrated with all the tiny details on the model. That frustration can be made even worse when using finely detailed miniatures, such as this 3D printed Raw Warrior. As a result, for painters who are just beginning the hobby, I suggest you start with a large or huge based miniature. Once you have some experience, then gradually begin reducing the size of your miniatures that you're painting. Just as a quick aside, since we're already painting bones, I thought I would also paint these bone piles from WizKid's Deep Cuts line of unpainted miniatures. Everything we're doing to the bone Naga, we're also doing to these little bone piles. When it comes to the entrails, we follow the exact same steps, but we use a red color scheme instead of a tan one. We want to carefully open the package of any of our miniatures with a craft knife. The reason for this is because we want to preserve the packaging. The plastic cover will make a great container for mixing paints, washes, thinning inks, and so on. When we're done with the packaging, we can recycle it. The bone Naga comes with a base that is roughly the same size as the bottom of the model, so we don't really need to glue on the base. We can use this base for some other project, so we'll just move on without using it. Now we want to look for some very obvious mold lines and flashing that's hanging off our model. If you look close enough, you'll always find imperfections in an injection model such as this, so beginners should only be concerned with really obvious mold lines and flashing hanging off the side of the model. To remove those fine lines and leftover plastic pieces, we can use an emery board used for filing fingernails. I found this pack of 36 various sized emery boards at Dollarama. Because our model is rather large, it should be quite easy to spot the plastic we want to remove. We use these fingernail files to flatten and remove the plastic mold lines on the miniature. Now we're going to start painting by covering our model with a base coat of colored primer. Even though the unpainted WizKid's miniatures are already covered with a primer, the gray doesn't really work with the color scheme we're going to be using. Despite popular depictions, bone are only stark white when bleached by sunlight and dried out, so we want our bone Naga to have a tan or sand color. As a result, I have two primers here, Xandri Dust from Citadel and Army Painter's Skeleton Bone. Both are great products, but are not the only ones used for base coating your miniatures. Make sure to follow the instructions on whatever primer you use to get the best results from the product. Now I've set up a small spray booth in my workspace and I have a pair of fans blowing through the space and the windows are open. It's important to be in a well-ventilated area when using spray cans. However, since I don't have a covered outdoor area, such as a garage, I'm using this setup. Next we need to affix our model to our pedestal so we aren't touching the mini when we spray it. I like to use poster putty, which can be found at warehouse and dollar stores. It's a lot like Play-Doh or plasticine and can be reused. We stretch it out like dough and fold it over and over on itself to heat it up. Then we stick the putty to the bottom of our model and affix it to the pedestal. We are also going to add our bone piles so we can spray everything at once. If you're priming more than one item at a time, make sure that they are evenly spaced so all sides can be sprayed. Now we're going to prime our miniatures. However, rather than explaining everything about spraying your miniatures here, please check out our foundations video on undercoats and priming. I'll put a link in the corner and in the description for you.
As we spray our models, we don't need to worry about spraying our hand because our minis are mounted on the pedestal. We also need to keep turning our models so we get an even coat of paint over all the different surfaces. Now that our primer is all dry, we can transfer our bone Naga to a more manageable pedestal and continue painting. We simply twist our model off the base and use the same tacky poster putty to attach our bone Naga to a smaller container. Don't forget that whatever we are doing to our large bone Naga, we are doing the same to our smaller bone piles. Since this video is for beginner painters, I want to mention a few things about paintbrushes. I mostly use dollar store paintbrushes for painting my terrain and miniatures. I suggest you start with a flat brush, a round brush, and a fine or detail brush. These are round and flat brushes, which you can plainly see have been abused with continuous use. This is a detail brush that I purchased at my local hobby store. This army painter brush was more expensive than all these other brushes combined, but I needed the fine pointed bristles. You will also encounter these cheap plastic brushes at dollar stores that are mixed in with the natural and synthetic fiber brushes. If possible, avoid these plastic bristle brushes. They're good for cutting up and turning them into tall grass or rushes and little else. I really don't like these brushes. These are makeup brushes that I also found at the dollar store. These brushes are terrific for dry brushing and adding large-scale glaze layers to your minis. If you're wanting some tips on how to care for your brushes, please check out our foundations video on basic tool care. Next, here are the colors that I've decided to paint the bones of our undead monster with. Most of these paints are from Citadel, but I also have some army painter in here. The brand of the paint doesn't really matter, but when it comes to painting miniatures, you don't want to use dollar store or bargain paints. Each color is named differently depending on the brand, but you can mix and match the brands. When we compare the colors I've chosen for our bone Naga, they're similar to our base coat. Without getting into a bunch of color theory or the breakdown of the difference between hue, tint, tone, and shade, we can just buy the colors we want to use on our minis. We are going to start with the dry brush layer, so we need a paper towel to remove the excess paint from our brush. We are going to use Citadel's Screaming Skull for our first layer of paint. We've already shaken the pot of paint very well so that the paint is mixed up. Now we load the brush with very little paint and remove the excess on our paper towel. We then drag our brush across the highest points on our mini to highlight those ridges. It's always better to add too little paint to a dry brush layer than too much, since we can always add another layer. For a full description on dry brushing, check out our foundations video. I'll put a link in the corner for you. For our second color, we're going to use Ushabti Bone in another dry brush layer. We're going to load our brush with even less of this color and spread it only in a few areas of our mini. The goal here is to create different areas of color on our model so it doesn't all look completely uniform. Next we are going to use Citadel's Mechanica Standard Gray, but any gray will do, to color the rocky base of our bone Naga. We are going to add some of the gray to our palette. We don't need a lot in order to cover the base. Then we add a drop of water to another area of our palette and mix the water with the gray to thin the paint. Now we can paint our base with the gray. Don't worry about getting paint on the bone parts of the model, since we can paint over them after the gray has dried. Next I'm going to switch to a brush with a much smaller point so we can paint between and under the bone Naga's legs. This is good practice to control your brush strokes so you don't get any paint on the bone Naga. It's perfectly okay to make mistakes. That's why we're practicing on a large model so we can easily see what we're doing and learn from our mistakes. Now we're going to use the Ushabti Bone to cover the Naga where we got gray paint on our model. Just like we did with the Mechanicus Gray, we're going to add a little water before we start painting. It's better to have the paint be too thin and have to add another layer than have the paint be too thick. Of course, when we're finished this, we can always cover over any tan spots we left behind on the gray base. Next I want to break up the all gray surface on our base by adding a few black areas. With some paint taken directly from the pot, we can add a few black features on the big stones of our rocky base. We don't want to add too many, we just want to change the surface a little so that it isn't all one color. For the next step, use a large flat brush to add the Agrax Earthshade to our model. We want to heavily apply the wash over the entire mini and the base. Gravity will pull the wash down into all the cracks and crevices of the bone Naga, which will help highlight all those areas. We want the wash to be relatively even over the entire miniature. Be careful that you don't let the wash pool in large areas or get stuck between the spines of our bone Naga. If you're new to painting with washes, you might wonder why we bothered painting the Mini before we added the wash. Despite what you may think, the wash doesn't cover the painted layers below it. It merely dims the lower layers, but they still show through. We should wait about 30 minutes to let the wash completely dry before we continue painting. Next, we are going to add a dry brush of Ushabti bone to highlight those surface features that we just dulled with the wash. This layer is going to make all our spines and features look more bone-like, while still preserving all the darkened nooks and crannies. We want an even layer here, but we need to be careful not to add this color to our base, or we'll have to repaint those areas. For the final dry brush layer, we're going to use this Praxeti white, which is an off-white. To do that, we're going to use this broad makeup brush. After dabbing the brush into the paint, we can see that some areas of the brush have these little clumps of paint. We want to avoid brushing our model with those clumps of color, so we swirl our brush on our napkin to spread out the paint. Then, just like we did before, we lightly sweep the brush over the entire model, including the base. This dry brush layer will make all the surface features appear bolder and more defined, and give our bones that classic dry bone appearance. The last feature we're going to add to our bone Naga is some green glowing eyes. We're going to use Citadel's Hexwraith Flame and Moot Green to achieve this glowing effect. We add a little water to our palette and use a detail brush. After we give the paint a good shake, for about a minute, we can add some to our palette. We want to water down the Hexwraith Flame, and using the detail brush we can get the paint into the vacant eye socket and surrounding areas. We want the Hexwraith Flame to be watered down so we can add multiple layers of green to the bone. We want the brighter concentration to be in the middle, where the source of the glow is coming from, and lighter the further away from the source we get. I added 3 different layers to the eyes to get the glowing effect. Now we add the Moot Green to the center of the eye socket. Again with the detail brush, we add only a tiny amount of paint to the very tip of the brush so we can get pinpoint precision in the placement of the paint. This will be the brightest point of the eye and the source of the glowing effect. If you want to make any changes to the paints, make sure that they're dry before adding another layer. After all, paint will look different wet than it does dry, and the underlying colors will have an effect on the paint's final appearance. The final embellishment on our bone Naga is to add another layer of Agrax Earthshade wash to our base. I think that the final white dry brush we added has made the stones pop a little too much, so I want to dim those highlights down just a bit. Another light wash over the rocky base will fix this issue and also give the stones a bit more definition. Once this wash has dried, we are finished painting our bone Naga. For new painters, it's a good idea to start creating painting habits to develop your skills, such as taking care of your paints and your brushes. Don't be afraid to mess up and make mistakes. A lot of mistakes. Watch all the other wonderful miniature painting creators out there, but don't let their expertise discourage you. Everyone started where you are at one time. Practice comes in many forms, such as controlling your brush, mixing colors, using glazes, contrasts, and washes, and the list goes on. Also remember that you don't need to spend a ton of money on supplies. You don't need every one of the colors available in order to paint miniatures. You don't need all the fancy gadgets to start painting. You do need a few good brushes, but most of them can be found for cheap online or at your local hobby store. We hope this tutorial was helpful, Triceratops Kid. Thanks for being an awesome Patreon subscriber. We really appreciate your support. For other viewers, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, now's a great time. We'd appreciate a comment, a thumbs up, and checking out our website at TheGameSmith.org and our Patreon page. Your support in any form is much appreciated. Until next time,
I'll see you at the table.